Hello, a warm welcome back to the dusty Codex. In 1565, the Mediterranean Sea was a battlefield, and the Ottoman Empire was an unstoppable superpower. And that superpower was coming for one tiny, defiant rock in the middle of the sea. We are always curious to know where our stories are traveling to, and where your corner of the world is. Please, take a moment to let us know in the comments where you are watching from today. In May of 1565, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent sent one of the largest armadas in history to crush the island of Malta. He sent over 40,000 elite soldiers, janissaries, spahis, and sappers, and more than 200 ships. Standing against this tide was a geriatric warrior and his brotherhood of fanatics. Grand Master Jean Parisot de Valette, a 70-year-old veteran, led the Knights of St. John. He had just 700 knights and a few thousand brave, but untrained, Maltese militia. This is the story of the Great Siege of Malta. It was not a battle, it was a 4-month-long nightmare of relentless bombardment, suicidal charges, and unimaginable brutality. It was a clash of empires, a clash of faiths, and a battle of sheer, bloody-minded will that would decide the fate of the Mediterranean for centuries. Suleiman's rage was personal. The Knights of St. John, or the Hospitallers, were a thorn in his side. They had been driven from their fortress on Rhodes by Suleiman himself decades earlier. From Malta, the Knights waged a holy war of piracy. They raided Ottoman shipping, freed thousands of Christian galley slaves, and disrupted the trade routes to North Africa. To Suleiman, they were a nest of vipers, and he was determined to exterminate them. He gave command of his army to the veteran Lala Kara Mustafa Pasha, with his greatest admiral, Piali Pasha, commanding the fleet. Their orders were simple: take the island, kill the knights, and enslave the population. When the massive Ottoman fleet arrived on May 18, 1565, the knights and the Maltese people, about 9,000 defenders in total, retreated into their two main strongholds, the fortified towns of Birgu, defended by Fort St. Angelo, and Senglea. But to use the harbor, the Ottomans first had to destroy the small, seemingly insignificant fort that guarded its entrance, Fort St. Elmo. The Ottoman commanders were confident. The fort was small, it was not well positioned for defense, and it was cut off from the main garrisons. Mustafa Pasha famously declared it would fall in 3 days. Grand Master de Valette knew St. Elmo was a sacrificial lamb. He needed it to hold out for as long as possible, to bleed the Ottoman army and buy time for a Christian relief force, the Gran Soccorso, to arrive from Sicily. The 3-day siege began. It turned into a 31-day nightmare. The Ottomans unleashed a relentless 24/7 bombardment from over 60 massive cannons, firing an estimated 130,000 cannonballs. The fort was reduced to rubble, but the defenders refused to fall. They fought from the ruins, repelling wave after wave of janissary assaults. They plugged the breaches with their own bodies. At night, Valette would send small boats across the harbor, evacuating the horribly wounded and bringing in fresh volunteers who knew they were sailing to their deaths. Finally, on June 23rd, the Ottomans launched an overwhelming assault. The last defenders, many too wounded to stand, were carried to the breaches in chairs, where they fought and died. The fort fell. The Ottomans had lost over 6,000 elite soldiers to take a fort defended by 1,500. Mustafa Pasha had won, but the cost was staggering. He famously looked at the main fortress of Birgu and said, "If the small child has cost us so much, what price must we pay for the father?" The siege now descended into pure savagery. In a fit of rage, Mustafa Pasha beheaded the bodies of the St. Elmo defenders and floated them across the harbor. Valette, in a rare act of matching barbarity, ordered all Ottoman prisoners decapitated. He loaded his cannons with their heads and fired them back into the Turkish camp. There would be no more talk of surrender. This was a war of annihilation. The full force of the Ottoman army now fell on Birgu and Senglea. For the entire months of July and August, in the searing, disease-ridden Mediterranean heat, they attacked. They tried mining, they tried siege towers, they tried all-out frontal assaults. The city was on the verge of collapse. A massive breach was opened in the walls of Birgu. The Ottomans poured in. Panic set in. But then, the 70-year-old Grand Master, Jean de Valette, grabbed a sword and a pike. He didn't send a messenger. He ran into the street himself, leading a suicidal countercharge with his personal staff. He was wounded, but he plugged the breach. This was the moment that defined the siege. Not a battle of tactics, but of pure, unbreakable, personal will. If these stories, where history is forged by the sheer, bloody-minded endurance of a single human being, are what you seek, I invite you to subscribe to the Dusty Codex. Your support allows us to continue unearthing these tales of impossible courage. The Ottomans tried a brilliant amphibious assault, using a bridge of boats to attack Senglea from the sea. They were annihilated by a hidden battery of cannons loaded with chain shot that Valette had placed at sea level. But the defenders were dying. They were running out of men, out of food, and, most critically, out of gunpowder. The entire siege had become a desperate, agonizing race against time. Where was the relief force? In Sicily, the Spanish viceroy, Don Garcia de Toledo, dithered. He was terrified of risking his fleet against the Ottoman armada. He kept promising to come, but he never left port. Finally, in early September, after months of delays, Don Garcia landed a small relief force, only 8,000 men, on a remote beach at the north of the island. The Gran Soccorso was not a massive army, but it was fresh and it was professional. They began to march south. The news hit the Ottoman camp like a thunderbolt. Their army was shattered. They had lost over 30,000 men to combat and disease. Their morale was gone. Mustafa Pasha, hearing exaggerated reports of the size of the relief force, panicked. On September 8th, the siege was broken. The Ottoman army, which had terrorized the Mediterranean, was routed. They scrambled back to their ships, abandoning their heavy cannons, their equipment, and their dignity. Valette and his defenders had won. The island was a smoking, desolate ruin, but it held. Of the 9,000 defenders, only 600 were still capable of bearing arms. The victory sent a shockwave through Europe. The myth of Ottoman invincibility was broken. Money poured in, and Valette began construction of a new, magnificent capital city, Valletta, named in his honor. The Great Siege of 1565 was a turning point. It marked the high watermark of Ottoman expansion in the Mediterranean. It ensured that Europe would remain European, and it was all thanks to the sheer, stubborn, impossible will of 700 knights, 8,000 Maltese, and one old man who refused to die. Thank you so much for watching this incredible story of endurance. We are honored to bring these hidden histories to light. If you want more stories like this, of battles that changed the world and heroes who refused to surrender, you can head on to our playlist to see more. Until next time, stay curious.